In the small community of Cobb, California, tucked into the mountains along the Sonoma-Lake County line, residents have stopped bothering to mention every individual tremor to each other. Dishes rattle in cabinets, door frames creak, a hanging picture frame tilts a few degrees, and nobody bothers to straighten it anymore because it'll just happen again in a few hours. Over the past 7 days, more than 80 separate earthquakes have been recorded in the ground beneath this specific stretch of Northern California, roughly 80 to 90 miles north of San Francisco. The strongest reached magnitude 4.0. Most were far smaller, barely perceptible outside the immediate area. I need you to understand something important right away, because the instinct when you hear 80 earthquakes in a week is to assume something catastrophic is building. That instinct is wrong here, and understanding exactly why it's wrong is actually the most useful thing this video can teach you. This activity isn't happening on the San Andreas Fault. It isn't a warning sign of an imminent major earthquake. It's happening at the geysers, the largest geothermal power complex on Earth, a place that has been reliably, predictably shaking almost every single day for more than half a century, for reasons that have far more to do with power plant engineering than with tectonic plates grinding toward a catastrophic release. So today, we're going to explain exactly what's happening at the geysers, why this specific patch of California produces more recorded earthquakes than almost anywhere else in the state, how this connects to, and importantly doesn't connect to, the broader tectonic seismicity we've covered elsewhere in Northern California recently, and what you should actually expect from this region going forward. Let's get into it. Let's start with the specific activity driving this video. Over the past week, more than 80 earthquakes have been recorded in and around the geysers geothermal field, a complex spanning roughly 45 square miles across the borders of Lake, Mendocino, and Sonoma counties in Northern California. The strongest event in this specific cluster reached magnitude 4.0, strong enough to be clearly felt by residents and workers throughout the immediate area, though no damage has been reported. The majority of the recorded events were considerably smaller in the magnitude 1 to 3 range, the kind of activity that shows up clearly on seismic instruments, but often isn't felt at all beyond the immediate vicinity. This isn't a single isolated event with a scattering of aftershocks. It fits the pattern seismologists specifically classify as a swarm, a cluster of earthquakes occurring close together in time and space, without one clearly dominant main shock that the others are responding to. The USGS has been direct about this distinction in its own public guidance. Unlike aftershocks, which follow a single larger quake in a predictable decay pattern, a swarm consists of multiple small tremors of broadly similar size, and these patterns can continue for durations ranging from hours to days, or in a location like the geysers, essentially indefinitely as an ongoing baseline condition. Let's explain exactly what this place is, because understanding its purpose is essential to understanding why it shakes so much. The geysers is the largest complex of geothermal power plants in the world, located roughly 72 miles north of San Francisco, according to the U.S. Geological Survey, home to 18 individual geothermal power plants operating across the region. Despite the name, it's not a field of geysers in the Yellowstone sense of the word. It's a geothermal energy production facility, harnessing naturally occurring underground heat to generate electricity for hundreds of thousands of homes across Northern California. Here's how it actually works, and here's exactly where the earthquakes come from. Deep beneath the surface, naturally hot rock formations heat underground water into steam. Power plant operators drill wells down into these formations to capture that steam, and pipe it to the surface where it spins turbines to generate electricity. But steam extraction alone gradually depletes the underground reservoir's pressure and fluid content over time. To sustain long-term production, operators inject water, some of it treated wastewater piped in from surrounding communities, back down into the hot rock through separate injection wells, replenishing the reservoir and sustaining steam generation for the plants above. That injection process is the direct mechanical cause of the region's seismic activity. When water is forced under pressure into fractured hot rock formations deep underground, it changes the physical stress conditions on pre-existing small fault surfaces within that rock. In some cases, the added fluid pressure directly reduces the friction holding a fault surface locked in place, allowing it to slip. In other cases, the simple redistribution of stress caused by injecting or withdrawing fluid at scale is enough to trigger movement on its own. The scientific literature refers to this broad category as induced seismicity, and the geysers specifically has been described by researchers as the most thoroughly studied example of induced seismicity tied to an enhanced geothermal system anywhere in the world. Decades of continuous operation here, combined with dense seismic instrumentation specifically installed to monitor the field, have made this single location one of the best real-world laboratories anywhere for understanding exactly how human fluid injection activity translates into measurable earthquakes. Here's the part that should genuinely reassure you. This pattern isn't new, isn't accelerating towards some kind of crisis, and isn't unique to this particular week. The Geysers has produced recurring earthquake swarms for as long as it's been in commercial operation. Earlier this year alone, a notable swarm struck the area in March, with a magnitude 2.4 event and a cluster of smaller earthquakes continuing into the following day. Occurring on the same day, a separate, unrelated earthquake struck near Aromas, more than 100 miles south, purely by coincidence. Individual magnitude 2 to 3 events at the Geysers are recorded on a near-constant basis, so routinely that most don't generate any news coverage at all. Occasional larger events, in the magnitude 3.5 to 4.5 range, punctuate that steady background activity every so often, drawing brief local attention before the region settles back into its normal near-daily rhythm of minor tremors. The USGS's own public guidance on this exact region is refreshingly direct about the distinction that matters most here. The major seismic hazards in this part of Northern California come from large earthquakes occurring on well-documented regional tectonic faults, specifically the San Andreas Fault and the Healdsburg-Rogers Creek Fault, both of which run through the broader area, but are physically separate structures from the specific rock formations being actively managed for geothermal production. The activities associated with steam withdrawal and fluid injection at the geysers produce their own distinct category of seismicity, largely confined to smaller magnitudes and directly tied to the operational rhythms of the geothermal field itself, rather than reflecting the accumulation of stress on the major regional faults capable of producing the kind of significant, damaging earthquake this part of California is genuinely at risk of experiencing eventually. Here's a genuinely interesting scientific detail that researchers studying this field have documented, and it's worth understanding because it shows just how sensitive this particular patch of ground actually is. Researchers studying the geysers found that the magnitude 6.0 South Napa earthquake, which struck in August of 2014 roughly 84 kilometers, about 52 miles from the geothermal field, did not produce any detectable increase in seismicity within one specific monitored zone directly at its center. However, that same distant earthquake did trigger a measurable increase in seismicity across the broader production zone elsewhere within the geysers. This is a real documented example of what seismologists call remotely triggered seismicity, where a significant earthquake occurring some distance away can, under the right conditions, nudge an already stressed fluid-saturated system like the geysers into producing additional activity, even without any direct physical connection between the two locations' fault structures. This finding is genuinely useful context for understanding just how uniquely responsive this specific stretch of ground is to outside stress changes, given how extensively it's already been altered by decades of fluid injection and withdrawal. It's also a good example of exactly the kind of legitimate, well-documented scientific triggering relationship that exists in earthquake science, in sharp contrast to the kind of unsupported, cross-continental earthquake triggering claims that circulate online without any real research behind them. If you've been following this channel's recent coverage of Northern California, you already know this region has had a genuinely active year, and I want to be precise about how the geysers' activity fits into that broader picture, because it's easy to lump everything happening north of San Francisco into one undifferentiated story. Earlier this summer, a magnitude 5.6 earthquake struck near Redwood Valley in Mendocino County on June 24th, identified by the USGS as the likely main shock of a genuine tectonic sequence that's gone on to produce more than 200 additional events. In late July, a magnitude 4.2 earthquake struck near Santa Rosa. Both of those events are meaningfully different from what we're discussing today. They're tectonic earthquakes produced by natural stress accumulation and release on genuine crustal fault structures in the broader Mendocino Triple Junction region, not induced by any human fluid injection activity. The geyser swarm we're covering in this video sits within roughly the same general geographic footprint of Northern California, but it's driven by an entirely separate physical mechanism tied specifically to an actively operating power facility rather than to the natural tectonic loading responsible for the Redwood Valley sequence. Telling these apart matters because they carry genuinely different implications. A tectonic sequence like Redwood Valley's is the kind of activity seismologists watch for signs of migration toward larger regional fault structures. Induced seismicity at the geysers, by contrast, is expected to continue indefinitely as a predictable byproduct of ongoing geothermal operations, and its long-term behavior is understood well enough that it doesn't carry the same kind of open-ended uncertainty a genuine tectonic sequence does. It's worth understanding that this isn't an unmonitored or unmanaged situation. Geothermal operators at the geysers, along with the seismic network monitoring the region, track this activity continuously and have developed operational practices specifically informed by decades of accumulated data on how injection rates and volumes correlate with subsequent seismicity. Enhanced geothermal systems and other injection-related industrial operations around the world increasingly use what's sometimes called a traffic light protocol, a tiered operational response where injection rates get adjusted and, in more serious cases, paused entirely if monitored seismicity in the surrounding area crosses specific magnitude or frequency thresholds. The geyser's decades-long operational history, combined with its uniquely dense seismic monitoring network, has made it one of the best-studied real-world test cases for understanding exactly how these kinds of operational adjustments do or don't influence subsequent seismic activity, feeding directly into how other geothermal and injection-based energy projects around the world are designed and regulated today. So, what should residents of this region, and anyone tracking this story, actually expect over the coming weeks and beyond? Expect this pattern to continue. The geysers has produced near constant minor seismicity for decades, and there's no scientific reason to expect that baseline pattern to meaningfully change so long as the field continues its current operational rhythm of steam withdrawal and fluid injection. Periodic swarms like this week's and periodic standalone events in the magnitude 3.5 to 4.5 range should be expected as a recurring, essentially permanent feature of this specific location, not a one-time anomaly. Expect this activity to remain distinct from and not predictive of activity on the region's major tectonic faults. Nothing in the documented science on induced seismicity at the geysers suggests this kind of activity meaningfully raises the risk of a significant earthquake on the San Andreas or Healdsburg-Rogers Creek fault specifically, even though all of these features sit within the same general region of Northern California. And more broadly, expect Northern California's overall earthquake hazard to remain what it's always been, genuinely significant and worth taking seriously on its own terms, independent of any single week's headline count. The USGS's own long-term forecasting model estimates roughly a 72% probability of a magnitude 6.7 or greater earthquake within 100 kilometers of San Francisco sometime in the next 30 years, and a 51% probability of a magnitude 7.0 or greater event in that same window. That statistic isn't tied to this week's geyser swarm or to the Redwood Valley sequence or to any other single recent event. It's a standing long-term regional hazard assessment that should inform how seriously Bay Area and Northern California residents approach earthquake preparedness every single year. Regardless of which specific fault or field happens to be generating the most recent headlines, if you live in or near the communities surrounding the geysers, Cobb, Anderson Springs, Middletown, and the broader Lake, Sonoma, and Mendocino County areas, or anywhere in the wider Bay Area region, here's what actually matters. First, treat continued minor shaking from the geysers as the expected, well-understood background condition it actually is, rather than a building crisis. If you live in the immediate area, you likely already have a practical, lived sense of this from prior years. And this week's swarm, while more active than average, fits within the documented historical range for this location. Second, don't confuse this activity with the genuinely separate tectonic sequences we've covered elsewhere in the region this year, specifically Redwood Valley and the broader Mendocino area activity. If you want to track those specifically, the USGS earthquake feed clearly distinguishes location and depth information that can help you tell induced geysers area events apart from tectonic activity elsewhere in the North Bay. Third, regardless of where specifically you live in Northern California, use the region's genuinely elevated long-term earthquake hazard, that 72% 30-year probability figure, as your actual standing motivation for household earthquake preparedness, rather than reacting only when a specific week's activity makes headlines. Secure heavy furniture, know your safe spots for drop, cover and hold on, and make sure your household has the MyShake app installed for shake alert early warning coverage. And fourth, if you're simply a curious observer rather than a resident of the immediate area, take this as a genuinely useful, low-stakes example of how to properly evaluate a dramatic sounding earthquake headline. Check the location, check the depth, check whether the activity is occurring near a known induced seismicity site like a geothermal field, and understand that many earthquakes and dangerous earthquake activity are frequently two completely different stories wearing the same headline. So here's where this stands as of today. More than 80 earthquakes have struck the geysers geothermal field over the past week, the largest reaching magnitude 4.0, part of a well-documented decades-long pattern of induced seismicity directly tied to the region's ongoing geothermal power operations, not a sign of a major tectonic earthquake building beneath Northern California. This activity sits in roughly the same broader region as this summer's genuinely tectonic Redwood Valley sequence and Santa Rosa earthquake, but it's driven by an entirely separate mechanism, one scientists understand unusually well thanks to decades of dedicated research at what remains the most thoroughly studied induced seismicity site on Earth. I'll keep tracking both this ongoing geysers activity and the region's separate tectonic sequences as they continue to develop. If breakdowns like this help you tell the difference between routine, well-understood seismicity and something genuinely worth watching more closely, subscribe, because that distinction is exactly what I'm trying to give you every time I cover a story like this one. I'll see you in the next one.